Hello, Art 2 students. So by now, everybody has started on your final version of your watercolor landscape. So this video is just going to show you some ideas, a couple of my examples, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can use some of the watercolor techniques that we have done in class. There will be a couple of other videos along with this unit that will sort of give you some ideas and some tips and some feedback and different ways that you can make trees and different things like that that you might want to include in your landscapes. So obviously your first step is going to be to have your landscape drawn very lightly in pencil on your paper so that everything is there, but you have no shading. You don't have any dark pencil lines. Everything is informative enough that you know where the color needs to be, but you don't have to worry about the graphite smearing and smudging and affecting your color. Now, one thing that I will tend to do as I am painting a landscape is as I'm working through, I erase pencil lines once I don't need them anymore. So for instance, on this one, I would start on the sky, and then once I finish with the sky, once it is dry, I might erase some of the pencil lines for the tops of the mountains. And then once I'm working in the mountains, once I don't need some of these outlines to show me where shadows and highlights go, then I would erase those pencil lines and keep doing that as I work my way through the page. And then before I do any final layers and things like that, I make sure that my pencil lines are as invisible or as erased as possible. Some of your pencil lines are going to show, and that's perfectly fine, because once you paint over them, you cannot necessarily erase them. And that's not an issue at all. That's just part of using watercolor paints, is drawing lightly and erasing the pencil lines you can as you go, but not worrying about the fact that they are not all going to erase. So here is one example that I have started. As you can see, I've started in the back, and you can tell that I'm working my way up to the front. And in the back on the sky of this one, I did a wet on wet. So I painted that whole sky area just with water first. And then I started with my darkest color and then added in some of the other colors. And I sprinkled a little bit of salt and a little bit of alcohol there just to kind of give the idea of moons and clouds and reflections in the sky. So that's one way that you can use the salt and or the alcohol technique. On this example, in the sky, I did something very similar. I did a wet on wet, but then most of the blue is here, and it gets lighter as it moves across. And then I clustered some salt here so that you can see sort of how some of that salt affects the page. And then again, you can tell that I'm working my way towards the front. On the other side of this one, all I've done so far is just a wet on wet, but I've let it be a little bit more vertical, a little bit more streaky almost, just so that it's a different type of effect. And on this one, I definitely did turn my page so that the water would all take the pigment towards the top so that it was lighter toward the bottom. So again, this one just has my sky so far with the salt technique and the underpainting on the mountains. This one is just an example where I was helping a student figure out how to draw a house to where you were looking up at it, and then how to start to get the light look like it's coming onto the snow from the windows. And then this page might be one of the ones that is the most beneficial to you all, simply because it does have some trees on it, shows how you can have those trees in the ground, shows a completely different type of tree. So this page is going to basically be where I add other just random little demos and tidbits as we go throughout the unit. Now, I've talked to a couple of you about how to do the pine tree type of thing, where you paint the trunk of the tree first, very lightly with watercolor, and then before that dries completely, just go kind of scribble almost with your paintbrush with the green to create that sort of evergreen effect. And then on this tree, I painted the trunk first again, did a little more shading this time, and left some of the white. Because you remember when you are using watercolor paint, the only way to completely get white in your paint, whether that's in the snow, whether that's in a highlight or a reflection, the only way to get white is to actually leave the paper white, leave the paper showing. So here I did the trunk with more detail, and then I've done a first layer on the trees, and all I've done is kind of just do that wet on wet where you have the two colors merging together, not so much a lot of water, but two wet pigments actually merging and blending together. I've seen people use the tissue technique on trees. I've also seen them use the saran wrap or plastic wrap and the tissue on mountains, so that always works really well. You can also use the white crayon if you have any areas where you specifically want there to be white speckles almost, like you know how trees sometimes get sort of like flocked looking, to where the snow is not in a big clump, it's more just kind of scattered on some of the branches or some of the leaves. Using a white crayon or a white oil pastel can help you with that effect, because once again, wherever you have that wax, it will resist the watercolor. You can also use the marker effect. We've done that some in my middle school classes, where instead of shading on the snow, we'll use a gray or a very pale purple marker in the shadow area, and then go back over that with water to blend that out and create the shading that you see there. Trying to think of some of the other techniques. But really, any of the techniques that we have used on your techniques page, you are welcome to use. I will be expecting you all to use at least some of those techniques. You don't necessarily have to use all of them or a whole bunch of them, but I do want to see some of the techniques be used. So now, since I have this one drawn, I'm going to go ahead and start on my sky here. And for this particular sky, I'm going to turn my page so that I can be using the tip of the brush along the edge of the mountains. And I'm going to do the wet on wet. And I would want to make sure that I have a reference image in front of me of what I might want that sky to look like. So right now I've got sort of just a sunset type of image. And the first thing I'm going to do is once again just paint that sky with some water here. You do want to go kind of fast because the water does obviously dry, and you want to make sure that it stays wet long enough for you to actually do the wet on wet technique. So one thing that I have found helpful is as you are going through and adding water to various parts of your space, just go ahead and go back to a spot where you've already put water and just put more down. It'll just continue to keep the page wet there. You can also sort of turn your head a bit, and you can tell how wet the page is, where you already have water, so on and so forth, so that you're not just repeating the same space over and over again. And right here where I get to the top of my tree trunk, I'm just going to paint right over it, because I'll still be able to see it through the watercolor as long as it's not too dark. And eventually it's going to become my tree trunk, but I want to make sure that I work from the back to the front. It will be very tempting to just jump right in with the detail, but if you do that, then you're going to end up having to paint around them. And your painting will not turn out as neat, you'll not be as happy with it, and it won't be as effective as it should or could be. So here I've got my wet on wet almost finished on my sky here, or at least the water part. Obviously there's no color yet. Now, because these are meant to be winter landscapes, that does not necessarily mean that there has to be snow. It just means that it should be obvious that it is winter. You can do that through decor that you use. If you have buildings in there, you can do it through the type of colors. So cool colors often are more wintry. So even if you use warm colors, you could use mostly cool colors in there, or even what could be considered a cool version of a color. So here I'm getting my paint wet now so that it will spread once I put it in here. Your paper is going to curl up a little bit. You can tape it to the table if you want to. That does sometimes help with that. It's just because we have water on the paper and it is just paper. So remember, this is just my first layer on the sky. Because as with anything, when you are adding layers and detail and things like that, you do want to work in layers. You do not want to just try to knock out your whole sky in one go. You want to get that whole first layer in there before the paint dries. But you do not want to necessarily be finished with that first layer, because there's always more that you can do. There's always more detail you can add. And I think on this particular example, I'm going to go back and use the lifting technique. So I'm going to make the sky pretty saturated, so that when I do show you the lifting technique, it's actually effective. And you can see how the clouds are recreated through that. And I will already have some value transitions within the actual original painting here, just because that's part of the wet on wet technique. So here I've got mostly warm colors, but I do have some areas where I've got some cool color, and I'm going to use a little more water to sort of blend the space together. Put more yellow up here so that I can bring my blue over, because I don't want to put the blue and the orange right next to each other because they'll make brown. So I do want to find a color that I can put kind of in between the two of them that will not muddy up. So now my paper is curling quite a bit, but what I'm going to do is go ahead and just tilt my page so that the color moves across the page a bit more. Because like I said, I am planning on using the lifting technique, so I want to make sure that my sky is pretty saturated and pretty even before I do that. So now I'm just going to grab a paper towel and wipe this up, let that dry just a little bit, and then I'll add a little bit more pigment, not a whole bunch of water, but just a little more pigment so that I can saturate that paint a little bit more before I go in to do the lifting technique once it is dry.